At 8:47 on a cool October morning in 1943, a young staff sergeant stood on a windswept airfield in England and watched a sky full of giants rise into the light. 291 B-17 bombers eased off the runway one by one, great silver shapes lifting through mist and exhaust, climbing toward a line on the map that crews already whispered about in low voices. The 19-year-old's name was Raymond Sullivan. On paper, he was an instructor. In reality, he felt like something much darker, a coach who kept sending teams into a game the rules of which were stacked against them. 7 months he had been on this field, teaching men how to handle the heavy guns in the noses and turrets of those bombers. 7 months he had watched planes take off in perfect formation and then come back full of gaps, with empty spaces where aircraft should have been and silent bunks where voices used to be. From the observation platform near the control tower, Raymond could already list the odds without looking at the latest brief. The target was the same industrial city deep in Germany that had already taken a heavy toll on the first attempt. The route was almost the same. The enemy's response would be the same, too, disciplined, fast, and terrifyingly efficient. He had heard it all in the debriefs, fast fighters rushing straight in from directly ahead, bright streaks passing through the bomber stream, crews barely having time to shout a warning before the first losses. Official manuals said there was a solution. They spoke calmly about deflection, about leading a moving target, about estimating closure speed and aiming ahead of where the fighter was, so that bullet and aircraft would arrive together at the same point in space. The diagrams looked clean. The formulas seemed logical. But the air over Germany did not respect neat diagrams, and human hands could not always keep up with the way real machines moved in 3 dimensions at almost unimaginable speed. Raymond had sat across from dozens of gunners, watching them memorize these principles, practice on moving targets at range, recite the rules by heart. Then he had watched many of those same men climb into aircraft, wave from the hatch with forced smiles, and vanish into cloud lines that seemed to swallow them. Some returned with stories of chaos unfolding faster than thought. Some did not return at all. Each time the pattern repeated, the young instructor felt the weight of a question he could not shake. If these methods worked so well on blackboard and training film, why were so many of his students not coming home? As the last bomber lifted off, the roar of engines rolled away into distance, leaving only the wind and the faint hum of generators. Raymond held a small metal object in his hand, turning it over with his thumb. It was a simple stopwatch he had bought on leave, the kind a track coach might use. In his pocket was a notebook, thick with cramped handwriting, angles, and numbers. Today, he told himself, he would stop guessing. Today he would measure. He knew that high above the countryside those B-17s would soon meet fast enemy fighters. He knew from after-action reports that the attackers liked to come from directly ahead, slightly above, using speed like a shield. What he did not know precisely was how long a gunner truly had from the first sighting shout to the moment the fighter flashed past the nose and was gone. 3 seconds. 2. Less. Somewhere inside that small window of time, he was sure, lay the truth about why the official method failed. Yet this story did not begin with a stopwatch or an airfield, or even with war. It began thousands of miles away, on open land far from any runway, at a time when the only things a boy named Raymond worried about were sick chickens and the sound of distant howls after sundown. On a farm near Junction City, Kansas, the sky was wide and the winters could be hard. The Sullivan family's livelihood depended on a simple equation. Healthy birds meant income, lost birds meant going without. Their flock was not large by any grand standard, roughly 200 hens that scratched and clucked inside a fenced yard behind the house. To Raymond's father, those birds were not just animals. They were groceries, school clothes, and the difference between paying a bill on time or not at all. Every cold season, trouble appeared from the hills. Lean shapes moved just beyond the fence line at dusk, quiet and patient. They knew the routines of the farm, the times when people were busiest or most tired. When the light faded and the family turned to chores or supper, the raiders came low and fast, slipping under wire or through weak boards, disappearing again into the dark with a flurry of feathers behind them. One winter, the family's losses climbed week after week. Raymond remembered his father's face as he counted the missing, the way his jaw tightened at the sight of scattered feathers near the coop. The numbers on the paper where he tracked egg sales no longer balanced. Feed still cost the same. Fuel for the stove still cost the same. The birds, however, were vanishing. On a grey afternoon, when Raymond was 12, his father took a narrow rifle down from 2 hooks on the wall and pressed it into his son's hands. It was a small caliber Winchester, old but well kept, the kind of tool that had been part of rural life for decades. "These birds are in your care now," his father said. There was no ceremony in his voice, only quiet urgency. "Keep them safe, and we'll be fine. Let those prowlers take them, and we all feel it." He did not lecture his son about ballistics or trajectories. Instead, he led Raymond out to the fence as twilight thickened. He pointed to the worn path the intruders liked to use and to the corner post where the fence turned toward the house. "They cut across here most every time," he explained. "They hug this line so they're in cover as long as possible. Don't chase them with the sights. Find a place they have to cross and wait." Raymond listened, chilled fingers wrapped around the wooden stock, eyes scanning the field. The idea sounded almost too simple. He was used to seeing people swing their rifles after moving targets, trying to match motion with motion. Here his father advised him to ignore the animal itself and focus instead on empty air. "Choose a fixed point in the landscape," he said, "and trust that the runner would pass through it. Put the bullet there at the right moment, and the rest would follow." That first evening, the boy did as he was told. He picked the vertical line of the corner post where the worn trail narrowed. When a shadow finally streaked across the field, headed for the coop with effortless speed, every instinct urged him to swing the barrel and chase it. Instead, he kept the sights locked on the post, held his breath, and waited the heartbeat it took for the blur to reach that invisible crossing. Only then did he squeeze the trigger. The result felt almost unreal. The rushing shape never reached the coop. One instant it was a streak of motion, the next it was tumbling in the grass. Its run ended before it could touch the fence. There was no time for second shots or corrections, no complicated calculations. It had simply intersected with the point in space where the bullet happened to be. Over the next seasons, the pattern repeated. Each time the animals returned, Raymond watched their paths, chose a fixed spot along their likely route, and kept his aim anchored there. The small rifle spoke, and the raids dwindled. The family's birds survived the winters in greater numbers. On paper, it looked like any other farm ledger correcting itself. In the boy's mind, however, a quiet understanding was taking shape. If you could predict where something had to pass, you did not need to chase it with your eyes. You only needed to meet it at that unavoidable place. Years later, standing on English concrete with a stopwatch in his palm, Raymond thought often of that fence corner back home. The shapes moving toward his students now were not wild animals but sleek fighters with engines and cannons. Yet they, too, followed paths dictated by speed, distance, and necessity. They, too, had to pass certain invisible points in the sky if they wanted to reach the bomber stream at all. The bombers that had climbed out of sight above England that morning were heading toward one of those invisible crossings, a corridor in the air that both sides in the conflict already knew by heart. On maps spread across briefing tables, it was a thin line threading past coastal defenses and inland cities. In reality, it was a long, tense stretch of sky where fast aircraft circled, waited, and then rushed in. Raymond could not be in the air with the crews he had trained, but he could follow their journey through voices and numbers. The control tower was alive with radio sets tuned to the units ahead. Operators leaned over consoles, scribbling notes as coded calls crackled in. To most people, it was a blur of jargon and call signs. To the instructor in the corner with the stopwatch, it was a stream of timing cues. As the bomber stream crossed the coastline and moved inland, reports stayed calm for a while. Altitudes, headings, weather conditions, formations holding steady. Raymond marked the time each report came in, creating a rough map of progress in the margins of his notebook. He knew, from previous missions and intelligence summaries, that the first serious opposition rarely came right at the border. It waded deeper in, where fighter units could mass for concerted action. When the first warning finally cut through the routine chatter, his thumb clicked the stopwatch without conscious thought. The voice on the radio was strained but controlled. Fighters ahead, high, forming. Another crew reported a broad group of enemy aircraft taking position above the bombers and slightly to the front, just where earlier accounts had said they would be. Raymond glanced at the second hand sweeping its circle. From the first sighting shout to the moment the fighters committed to their dive, how much time truly passed? He listened to altitude calls, to the short burst of commands inside the formations, to the strained tone that always crept in when pilots and gunners shifted from routine to survival. The fast aircraft began their run. In his notebook, arrows and numbers lined up with the radio traffic. Combined speeds, distances closed per second, approximate ranges at which gunners usually opened fire. With each new pass described over the air, he added another line of figures. What emerged was not reassuring. In the span of perhaps 3 heartbeats, An attacker could cover more than half a kilometer. By the time a gunner spotted a dark speck ahead, recognized it as hostile, swung his turret, and tried to match its angular movement, the geometry had already changed. The instructor imagined a man in a glass bubble, hands on twin grips, told to lead a target that was almost instantly in a different place than where he had first seen it. Some few exceptionally practiced shooters might still manage to put a burst in the right zone by intuition alone. Most would do what human reflex naturally did under pressure: center the moving threat in the sights and fire straight at it, following as best they could. The math in Raymond's notebook showed, in cold digits, why so many reported long streams of traces curving harmlessly behind the oncoming shapes. Back on the farm, the boy he once was had not needed to think about angles in degrees per second or time-of-flight tables. He had relied on a simpler truth: if an animal wanted the chickens, it had to pass between the low stump and the fence post, or under a sagging section of wire. The path was not optional. It was baked into the landscape. At the airfield now, he stared at a sketch of a bomber and a diving fighter and saw, not just a collision course, but a mandatory window of air the enemy would cross. With each raid that came back with fewer aircraft, the sense grew stronger that the official doctrine was asking too much of average nerves. Expecting a gunner to solve a complex moving target puzzle in not quite 3 seconds, while noise, vibration, and flashes filled his limited view, was simply unrealistic. Yet telling him to ignore the attacker and fire into apparently empty sky sounded like madness. The second hand on the stopwatch completed its circuit again and again while the radio brought more fragmentary reports. A crew somewhere ahead announced that one of their number had fallen behind, then went quiet. Another spoke of a nose section damaged, of wounded men being tended while the aircraft tried to hold formation. Through it all, Raymond's pencil scratched on. By the time the bombers turned toward home, many of his suspicions were no longer vague frustrations but clearly outlined inequalities between what paper assumed and reality delivered. Hours later, when the first silhouettes of returning bombers appeared as tiny dots against the western sky, the airfield came alive. Ground crews lined the runway with vehicles and stretchers, counting as each plane turned on final approach. Raymond stood where he could see the lists being updated in real time, each line either filled with a tail number or left blank. 291 had left. Fewer came back, exactly as he had feared. Every blank line on the board represented 10 men who had not landed on that strip of concrete. Some would be in other fields, forced down short of home. Some would be in captivity. Many would not be heard from again. When he looked at those gaps, he did not see just the thunder of flak or the bright streaks of cannon shells. He saw numbers on his own pages and the nagging thought that a different pattern of fire might have changed the outcome for at least some of them. Later, in a cramped debriefing room that smelled of sweat and coffee, he listened as surviving gunners described their attempts. The stories from different crews matched in one crucial detail. The fighters came fast from the front, nose slightly dipping, and then everything became a blur. Men spoke of squeezing the trigger as soon as the attacker crossed into sight, of trying to pull slightly ahead of it, of seeing traces streaming out and curving in wide arcs that never quite caught up before the fighter flashed past. To anyone else, these were just recollections of another hard mission. To the instructor with memories of fence lines and narrow trails, they were pieces of a pattern. As he walked back out into the evening air, notebook tucked under his arm, the idea that had been circling in his thoughts for weeks finally settled into a firm decision. If chasing fast shapes in the sky did not work, he would stop asking his students to chase. He would try to teach them to build an invisible fence instead. The challenge was obvious. Changing a man's habits in a classroom was one thing. Convincing him to hold his gun steady on a seemingly empty spot in the sky while something dangerous rushed toward him was another. Before he could ask anyone else to trust such a method in real combat, he needed proof that it could work at all. That meant finding volunteers willing to practice it under controlled conditions, and a way to simulate those head-on attacks without crossing into real peril. It also meant facing resistance from people who believed, with good reason, that established procedures existed for a purpose. In a system built on order and discipline, a sergeant suggesting that the training manuals were asking too much was bound to raise eyebrows. Yet the picture of incomplete formations and lined-out aircraft numbers was still fresh in his mind. Staying silent felt more risky than speaking up. That night, as the base settled into an uneasy quiet, Raymond spread his notebook out on his bunk and reviewed every line. He traced the imaginary path of an enemy fighter diving straight toward a bomber's nose. Halfway down that path he marked a single point in space, a small X on the paper. No matter how many times he redrew the lines, that X was always in the same place relative to the bomber, because any fighter coming in on that vector had to pass through it. On the farm, the corner of the fence had served that function. Here, the equivalent was an invisible point a certain distance out along the approach vector. The only question now was whether human eyes and hands could be trained to lock onto that intangible place and stay there until the rushing shape intersected it. If they could, the gunner's task would shrink from solving a puzzle in motion to simply holding a fixed aim and pressing the trigger at the right moment. Raymond closed the notebook, the idea now fixed more firmly than the numbers themselves. He had been given the job of keeping others alive, using every tool and insight he could find. If that meant bringing a piece of Kansas into the air war over Europe, then that was what he would do. The next step was finding people who had seen enough of the current methods to be open to something unconventional. Opportunity arrived the following afternoon, in the form of tired men filing back into the debriefing hall after yet another mission. Some looked scarcely older than the instructor himself. Others had the worn expressions of crews who had counted their missions one by one for far longer than anyone had expected at the outset of this campaign. Raymond waited near the back while intelligence officers asked their standard questions, marking routes, estimating enemy numbers, compiling the continuous picture of the air war. The gunners, for their part, spoke about tracer streams, engine noise, flashes ahead of the formation. They mentioned how difficult it was to judge distance when everything seemed to rush directly at them. When someone described a head-on attacker as a car on a straight road coming at you at highway speed, but you're not allowed to move your steering wheel, a few tired chuckles rippled through the room. When the formal part of the session ended, and most of the officers moved on to their next task, Raymond approached a man he had seen on base many times before. The name stitched over his chest was Morrison. He had carried himself earlier with a mixture of ease and tension that suggested both experience and frustration. "Sergeant," Raymond said quietly, nodding in greeting. "Mind if I ask you something off the record?" Morrison gave a small shrug, eyes still distant from the day's events. "If it's not about what we had for lunch, sure." "How many times did you fire today?" The gunner thought for a moment. "Few hundred rounds," he answered. "Maybe more. We had at least 2 front passes where I could see them. Let loose both times." "And results?" Morrison hesitated, then gave a short, humorless laugh. "Results are that I'm standing here and so are you. Out there, though, I didn't see any of them break off because of me. Maybe someone else got lucky. Felt like I was painting the sky and nothing else." Raymond nodded. This matched what he had heard from others, but hearing it stated so plainly helped. "What if I told you," he said slowly, "that I've been working on a way to give you a better chance when they come head-on? Something that doesn't require you to try to guess where they'll be half a second from now." The other man narrowed his eyes, curiosity flickering behind the fatigue. "If this is another set of charts, you can keep it. The last set didn't do much for us." "It's not a chart," Raymond replied. "It's more like picking a spot and letting them run into it. No complicated leading. Just one chosen place." The gunner tilted his head. "You make it sound like you're waiting behind a barn door with a bucket of water." The instructor almost smiled. "Closer to waiting by a fence on a farm," he admitted. "I grew up herding problems into one point instead of chasing them." He lowered his voice a little. "I know how it sounds, but I've run the numbers, and I think it can work. I need people who've seen the current way in action, and who are willing to try something different on the training range. No one's asking you to change what you do in the air without proof. Just come see if it makes sense." Morrison studied him for a long moment. Out the window, a ground crew was guiding a bomber with a damaged nose gear into its bay. The day's mission was still hanging heavily over everything. Finally, the gunner nodded. "If it means I'm not just watching tracers go nowhere, I'm listening. But I want to see it, not just hear about it." "Fair," Raymond said. "I'll set up a session. Bring a few others you trust. People who won't laugh it off before they've tried it." Over the next day, 5 more gunners agreed to join the experiment. Each had their own story, but all shared one thing. They had aimed carefully on previous missions and still watched enemy fighters pass unharmed. One had nicked an attacker once by pure chance and was now hungry for a more reliable process. Another had lost his closest friend from a side position while trying to focus on the front, leaving him determined not to let such opportunities slip by again. Raymond booked time at the gunnery range, where old bomber fuselages sat on rough supports, stripped of engines but equipped with functional turrets and guns loaded with harmless marking rounds. He also needed a pilot willing to play the part of the incoming fighter. That request raised eyebrows at flight operations, but eventually they found a rugged P-47 driver who had completed dozens of real missions and possessed enough confidence to let trainees aim at his aircraft with training ammunition. When the volunteer pilot, Captain Fletcher, heard that the plan involved gunners not tracking him at all, but holding their aim on a fixed point ahead of the bomber he would be pretending to attack, he shook his head in disbelief. "That's not how this is supposed to go," he said lightly. "You track, you adjust, you shortburst. If they just spray into space, I fly through the gaps and wave." "That's what we are here to test," Raymond replied. "Not spraying. Aimed fire at a point that every head-on attacker has to cross if he wants to reach the bomber. Think of it like this. You've flown enough of these runs. You know the line you follow when you commit, right?" Fletcher nodded. "Sure. Once I push over, there's only so much room to change my mind." "Exactly," Raymond said. "We are going to aim at that line instead of at you. If I'm wrong, you'll come back with clean paint. If I'm right, you're going to see a lot of chalk marks in one particular section of your aircraft." The pilot looked at the 6 gunners gathered around, seeing not raw recruits but men who had already faced the real thing. There was no bravado in their expressions, only a focused hope that this might offer them something better. At last he sighed and slapped the fuselage of the practice bomber. "All right, farm boy," he said. "Let's see what the fence trick does to my wings." Raymond climbed into the top turret alongside Morrison for the first run, not to handle the guns himself but to talk the shooter through what would happen. He pointed out where, relative to the bomber's nose, the fixed point would be. "Imagine a dot out there about this far," he said, tracing an imaginary circle on the glass. "The moment you see him start his dive, bring your aim to that dot and lock it. Do not follow him. Even when every part of you is yelling at you to track, ignore that. Trust that he has to cross that place if he keeps coming." Morrison flexed his hands on the grips, taking a slow breath. "And if he jinx, then he's not truly committed to the classic run, and you switch back to what you know," Raymond answered. "We are not erasing everything, just adding a tool for those straight-in lines that have been so hard to handle." Below them, engines roared to life. The P-47 lifted into the sky, circled to gain altitude, and then lined up with the runway and the mock bomber Hulk. From the turret, the fighter was at first just a speck, then a growing shape with wings and stubby nose, just as it would look in combat. "Remember," Raymond murmured, "don't chase. Find the spot. Hold it." As the incoming aircraft grew larger in the sight glass, Morrison's instinct screamed at him to follow it, to swing ahead as he had been trained. But he forced himself to keep the aiming circle nailed to the invisible point, the empty space that looked like nothing at all. At the range where they had calculated the intersection, Raymond gave a calm, firm command. "Now, hold and fire." The gun spoke, a steady line of glowing trainers reaching out towards seemingly blank air. A heartbeat later, the P-47 flew directly into that stream of light. From below, range officers saw puffs of chalk on the metal skin and along the wing root as the safe rounds did exactly what real steel would have done. The fighter pulled up smartly and banked away, calling over the radio with a surprised tone that cut even through the static. Back on the ground, when Fletcher rolled to a stop and climbed down, the evidence was clear. White marks dotted one area of his aircraft in a concentrated band. He ran a hand along them and turned to look at the small group by the practice bomber. "If these had been the real thing," he said, "I'd be looking for a new ride. That run would have been the last one." The 6 gunners exchanged glances, something like cautious excitement breaking through their habitual reserve. For the first time, they had seen a representation of what might happen if they stopped trying to outguess the attacker's motion and instead forced the attacker to meet their fire at a predetermined point. The theory from the notebook had left the page and painted itself across aluminum. There was still much to test, of course. One successful pass did not rewrite doctrine. But that afternoon, as each of the 6 men took a turn in the turret with the same instructions and the same fixed point, and as the pilot returned each time with more streaks and spots on his wings, confidence began to solidify into something stronger. And with each successful pass, one question grew louder in Raymond's mind. If this works so reliably in practice, how many actual crews might still be flying if they had been shown this trick earlier? By the time the training day ended, the sun was sliding low over the range, and pale chalk still dusted the metal of the cooperative fighter. The range officers had recorded each pass carefully, counting how many times the marking rounds touched the designated zone. Their notes told a consistent story: 6 different gunners, 6 different temperaments, but each had managed to place a meaningful string of hits when using the fixed-point approach. For Raymond, the success was both encouraging and sobering. Encouraging, because the idea clearly translated into practice. Sobering, because he knew exactly how far this small group stood from the authority needed to spread such a change. They had proven something to themselves and to one open-minded pilot. They had not yet convinced the layers of command that controlled official training. That evening, as the 6 gunners crowded around a mess table with metal trays and hastily poured coffee, conversation kept returning to the same realization. This felt different from anything they had been taught before. "I'll tell you one thing," Morrison said, tapping his mug with one finger. "Holding a steady aim on that empty spot was harder than chasing him. Every habit I got says follow the target. But those chalk marks don't lie. Feels like we were setting a snare." Brennan, the quiet ball turret gunner, nodded. "I got used to tracking birds back home, watching wings, leading them by feel. This is almost the reverse. You fix your lane and wait for them to step into it." Another of the group, a thoughtful mechanic-turned gunner, traced a simple line on the table with his spoon. "Out there, when they come in front on, they don't have many options," he mused. "They've chosen their line. Maybe it makes sense that we choose ours too, instead of dancing after them." Raymond listened more than he spoke, making mental notes. These men were translating his numbers into their own language: snares, lanes, lines, finding ways to fit a new concept into the framework of skills they already possessed. It was exactly what he had hoped would happen. For a method to take hold, it could not live only in diagrams. It had to become something a tired mind could remember under pressure. Still, the instructor knew that informal enthusiasm would only go so far. If this technique remained a side project tested by a handful of crews, its impact would be limited. To truly shift the odds, it needed official sanction, range time, and integration into standard practice. That meant taking his notebook and these early results to someone high enough to authorize changes, and someone practical enough to listen to a junior non-commissioned officer bringing unsettling news about existing doctrine. The first attempts to go through regular channels did not go well. Requests to present alternative fire control concepts were met with polite but firm replies directing him back to established manuals. The system was not designed for bottom-up innovation. It assumed that procedural changes came from specialized boards, not from an instructor who had grown up guarding a chicken yard. At last, faced with the slow grind of paperwork, Raymond made a choice that would have seemed unlikely for the reserved farm youth he once was. He simply went in person. With his notebook under his arm and the memory of chalk marks on the fighter's wings in his head, he walked into the administrative building that housed the senior leadership of one of the bomber divisions. An aide at the front desk looked up as he entered. "Can I help you, Sergeant?" "I hope so," Raymond replied, standing a bit straighter. "I need 5 minutes with the general. I have training results that could reduce losses on head-on attacks." The aide's expression tightened into the careful neutrality of someone used to filtering requests. "The general's schedule is full. If you'd like to submit a summary through your chain of command." "I've done that," Raymond said quietly but firmly. "What I have is not a theoretical proposal. We tested it on the range. 6 experienced gunners, repeated passes, a live pilot. The method worked each time. I'm not asking for an hour. Just 5 minutes for him to see the numbers." The aide hesitated, clearly weighing the risk of turning away someone who might actually be carrying something valuable against the risk of interrupting his superior without cause. Before he could decide, a voice came from a nearby doorway. "Who says he can cut losses on frontal passes?" A tall officer in a simple uniform without excessive decoration stood there, watching the exchange with a calm but focused gaze. Raymond recognized him from a distance. Major General Anderson, a man known more for spending time near the flight line than behind a big desk. "That would be me, sir," Raymond replied, stepping closer. "I'm Staff Sergeant Sullivan, gunnery instructor. I've been timing the attacks and testing a fixed-point aiming method with volunteers. We have range results that don't match what the manual expects." "Inside," Anderson said, nodding toward his office. "You've got your 5 minutes. Use them well." The general's office was functional rather than ornate. Maps on the walls, a few photographs, stacks of folders. He gestured for Raymond to place the notebook on his desk and to open it where he thought best. The young instructor started with the simplest explanation he could manage. He sketched the standard head-on approach, quoted the measured closure rates and the brief window for engagement, then demonstrated how far an attacker traveled during the time it took a bullet to reach him. He did not claim that no one could solve the leading problem under those conditions. He simply pointed out that the mental load was enormous for the average gunner in those few seconds. Then he turned to the idea drawn from his youth, choosing a fixed point along the enemy's path and committing fire to that point instead of chasing the moving aircraft. He showed the diagrams from the training range, the distances they had selected, the timing cues they had used. Finally, he presented the tally sheets from the P-47 runs. Multiple hits recorded on each pass when the new method was used. Anderson listened without interruption, occasionally narrowing his eyes at a particular number or asking for clarification on a timing detail. When Raymond finished, the office was quiet for a moment except for the faint hum of activity in the hallway. "You're saying," the general summarized at last, "that by simplifying the gunner's job to aim here and hold, you reduce the chance that he will lag behind the target. And your range work suggests that, at least in controlled conditions, average shooters can get good results with this." "Yes, sir," Raymond answered. "We are not taking anything away. We are giving them a way to handle the one kind of attack that has been the hardest. When those fighters commit from the front, they're walking into a predictable corridor. Our people just need permission to put a barrier there." Anderson leaned back, fingers steepled. "Doctrine isn't a sacred text," he said slowly. "It's a set of best guesses we refine as we learn. Right now, those frontal assaults are hurting us badly. If you can shift that balance even a little, I'm interested." He tapped the notebook thoughtfully. "How many gunners have you trained so far?" "6 directly, sir. They're ready to instruct others. I can train more, but I'd need more range time and official backing so units feel free to take part." The general closed the notebook and slid it back across the desk. "You'll have both," he said. "I'll authorize you 3 days of intensive work and volunteers from several groups. If your results hold with a larger sample, we expand. If they don't, we chalk it up as a useful experiment. Either way, this stays focused on practical outcomes, not theory. Understood?" "Yes, sir," Raymond replied, a mixture of relief and resolve washing through him. "Good," Anderson said. "Because if this works, I want our crews using it before the next deep raid, not after. Go get your people." The next days were some of the busiest of Raymond's life. Word spread quickly through the bomber groups that a new training program was being offered, one specifically aimed at dealing with the dreaded front-on attacks. The unofficial stories carried more flavor than any formal notice could have. Tales of a farm-bred instructor who had found a way to make fighters fly into your line of fire, of a hardened P-47 pilot who had come back from the range dusted in chalk. From this mix of curiosity and cautious hope came a steady stream of volunteers. Some were senior gunners who had already flown many missions and understood exactly what was at stake the next time a dark cluster of shapes appeared ahead of their formation. Others were newer crewmen who had not yet completed their full tour but had seen enough to know that any advantage mattered. Raymond organized them into small groups, each led by one of the original 6 who had tested the method. These experienced men now shifted into instructor roles, explaining the principle in their own words. It was one thing to hear a quiet sergeant from Kansas talk about fence posts and fixed points. It was another to hear a respected fellow crew member say, "I tried this on the range, and for the first time I watched my rounds actually intersect where an attacker would be." On the practice range, the routine settled into a rhythm. Each group would climb into the stationary bomber fuselage in turn, rotating through top and nose positions. The cooperative fighter would make its simulated runs, diving in along the approach vector. The trainees would fight the temptation to chase and instead lock their aim on the shared invisible point ahead. Missteps happened, of course. Some gunners reverted to their old habits mid-pass, instinctively swinging after the incoming aircraft and scattering their fire. When that occurred, the instructors would patiently step through what had happened, pointing out how quickly the line of sight had shifted and how much more stable the pattern of hits became when the aim stayed fixed. Gradually, the idea that had once seemed counterintuitive started to feel more natural. Phrases like "hold your lane" and "trust the crossing" began to circulate in the informal talk between sessions. For men whose daily lives already involved memorizing checklists and procedures, this new mental model added one more vital tool, but one that many found surprisingly simple to recall under pressure. Find the point, fix on it, let the attacker come to you. Meanwhile, Anderson kept a close eye on the progress. Reports from the range reached his desk each evening, summarized in clear terms. The percentage of passes with meaningful marks on the fighter's forward area rose as more trainees became comfortable with the method. In notes scribbled in the margins of those reports, The general wrote brief comments to himself, promising, repeatable, scale up. The real test, however, would not take place over a quiet training field. It would happen when those same gunners were back in their flying fortresses, high above cloud layers, listening for the telltale call that fighters were assembling ahead. Until then, all the chalk marks and range scores were only preparation. That test came sooner than anyone expected. Within weeks, a new mission was scheduled that would send a large formation along a familiar corridor, deep into contested airspace. Raymond knew several of the crews involved. Among them were aircraft whose gunners had spent hours on the fixed-point range. Their presence in the mission briefing room brought an unusual undercurrent of energy. At the pre-flight talk, the operations officers covered the usual details: altitudes, course corrections, anticipated opposition, contingencies for aircraft that were damaged. When the subject of enemy tactics came up, especially the preferred front-on attacks, a few heads turned almost unconsciously toward the corners of the room where Raymond and his instructor group stood. No one made a dramatic announcement. This was not a story for speeches. Instead, during the final moments before crews headed out to their aircraft, brief exchanges took place near the coffee urn or the coat rack. A nod from a turret gunner to his instructor. A quiet reminder: remember the point, stick with it on the first run. A half-joking comment about putting that invisible fence back up in the sky. As the bombers rolled down the runway and lifted off, the airfield again fell into that mixture of motion and waiting that Raymond had come to know so well. He returned to his position near the control tower, stopwatch at the ready, not because he needed to recalculate anything but because it had become a symbol of his role, measuring the thin slices of time in which entire futures were decided. Hours later, when the first reports crackled over the radio, he leaned closer. The early part of the flight unfolded much as previous ones had, with weather updates and formation checks. Then came the familiar, tightening phrase: fighters sighted ahead. This time, though, as the descriptions of the engagement came in, there was a subtle difference. Mixed with the urgent calls about closing aircraft were brief, almost surprised exclamations: got one turning away with smoke, front element breaking up, they're pulling off sooner. These comments were scattered and incomplete, but they hinted at a new dynamic. In the debriefing that followed the mission, the contrast with previous raids became clearer. Crews from aircraft whose gunners had trained on the fixed-point method described a different feeling when the first enemy formation committed to the head-on run. Rather than swinging their turrets in a frantic attempt to keep up, they had brought their sights to the chosen forward point, steadied themselves, and held fire until the range they had practiced. When they crossed into it, it was like they found something they weren't expecting, one gunner said, gesturing in the air as if tracing the lines again. I saw flashes on their wings, saw them hesitate. They didn't just sail past untouched. Some of them broke away earlier, like they'd suddenly remembered they could be on the receiving end too. Another described watching his own traces for once intersect with the space the attacker occupied, rather than trailing just behind. He wasn't sure whether he had brought any aircraft down himself, but he knew with certainty that he had finally been present in the equation, not just a bystander drawing bright lines in the air. The most telling numbers came from the losses board. The formation had not escaped unscathed. No one expected that. But among the aircraft that carried the newly trained gunners, the rate of loss had been noticeably lower. In a context where every percentage point mattered, that difference loomed large. When these results reached Anderson, he did not hesitate. The limited experiment had passed its first real-world trial. Quietly but firmly, he instructed his staff to treat the fixed-point technique not as an optional supplement but as a priority subject for all frontal defense training. Raymond's small instructor team suddenly found their workload expanding dramatically. For the young sergeant from Kansas, this shift brought its own challenges. He still thought of himself as a practical man who had applied a childhood lesson to a new domain, not as a theorist or architect of doctrine. Yet as he stood before larger and larger groups of trainees, chalk in hand, sketching the invisible crossing points on blackboards, he could feel the edges of something broader taking shape. What had begun as a personal attempt to reduce the number of blank lines on the return board was becoming part of a larger change in how an entire force thought about engaging a particular threat. And though his name did not appear on the mission orders or the bold headlines of newspapers back home, the quiet adjustments he was teaching were starting to ripple outward in ways even he could not fully see. As autumn turned to winter, the weather over Europe grew less forgiving, but the training schedule at the gunnery ranges remained intense. New crews arrived from stateside schools. Experienced ones came back between missions for refresher sessions. In hangars and classrooms, diagrams of air engagements gained an additional set of markings. little crosses placed ahead of bomber silhouettes, representing those crucial fixed points where attackers would be met. Raymond and his growing circle of fellow instructors refined their approach as they went. They learned which explanations resonated best with different kinds of students. For those with hunting backgrounds, references to familiar experiences, leading game along predictable paths, positioning oneself along a known route, made the concept click. For men who had worked with machines or assembly lines, the focus shifted to timing, synchronization, and the idea of two moving elements meeting at a planned intersection. What remained constant in all these conversations was the emphasis on simplicity under stress. The instructors did not hide the underlying math from those curious about it, but they insisted that, in the turret, the gunner's mental script should be short: recognize the front on commit, pick the practice point, hold firm, engage for the brief window when the attacker passed through. Out beyond the training zones, the effects of these lessons began to show up not only in individual stories but also in the aggregate data that analysts compiled. Reports from formations that had adopted the fixed-point method consistently noted higher rates of enemy fighters breaking off their attacks, as well as more sightings of enemy aircraft trailing smoke or leaving the area with visible damage. Enemy intelligence likely noticed something as well. Intercepted communications and later historical accounts suggested that certain attack patterns, once favored for their relative safety and effectiveness, were gradually being reconsidered. When crews who had previously approached frontal engagements with near certainty found themselves encountering concentrated fire in precisely the zone they needed to pass, the cost-benefit equation shifted. Within headquarters, these changes were usually described in dry terms: improved defensive response, adjusted fire control techniques, reduced vulnerability to direct approach maneuvers. In the barracks and at the mess tables, the language was less formal. Men spoke of the day the front stopped feeling like an open gate and started feeling more like a guarded doorway. Through all of this, Raymond's own contributions remained largely invisible outside of training circles. He was content with that, for the most part. The satisfaction he felt when a gunner returned from a mission, spotted him on the flight line, and offered a quiet nod or a few words of appreciation was more personal and immediate than any official recognition could have been. One evening, after a particularly busy rotation of trainees, he found himself back at his bunk with the old notebook open again. The early pages, filled with tentative sketches and margin notes, seemed almost naive now against the more precise diagrams that followed. Yet he felt a deep affection for those crude drawings of fence posts and coyotes, for they marked the moment when he had first dared to think that a simple rural trick might belong in the same conversation as formal military practice. He also knew that the story of this method would almost certainly be written in broad strokes, if it was written at all. Institutional reports tended to attribute significant changes to departments or commands, not to individual instructors. The phrase training innovations might appear in a summary somewhere, but the path from a Kansas farm to a revised gunnery manual would be compressed into a single line, if it was mentioned. Still, the core fact remained: more crews were returning, and their chances during frontal engagements had improved. That understanding anchored him more firmly than any footnote could. Eventually, the day came when the direction of his own service shifted. The same qualities that had made him effective as an instructor in England, his ability to translate complex concepts into practical steps, were needed back in the United States, where new waves of airmen were being prepared for overseas duty. Orders arrived assigning him to stateside gunnery schools, where he would work not with battle-hardened crews but with young trainees whose only experience of bombers came from training flights and classroom films. Leaving the base where he had spent so many months was bittersweet. He walked one last time past the range where the chalk-dusted fighter had once circled. He paused by the corner of the field from which he had watched those first missions vanish into the clouds. He exchanged farewells with gunners who now wore the calm, serious expressions of veterans and who carried, in their muscle memory, the lesson of invisible points in the sky. In the United States, the environment was different, but the stakes were no less real. The gunnery schools buzzed with activity as instructors from various backgrounds converged to turn raw recruits into functioning crew members. Here, Raymond's method was not an unofficial experiment but a subject increasingly woven into the curriculum, thanks to the formal endorsements that had followed the European trials. He adapted his teaching style to the new environment, knowing that these young men had not yet felt the shock of a real engagement but soon would. He emphasized not only the mechanics of the fixed-point approach but also the importance of calm focus when everything in a person's instinct told them to fall back on frantic movement. He shared just enough about his experiences to give weight to his words without overwhelming his students with stories of loss. Over time, the fixed-point technique moved from being associated with one instructor's name to being simply how we do it in certain situations. It appeared in manuals, in training films, in the vocabulary of instructors who had never met the man from Kansas but knew the diagrams and the cues by heart. This diffusion had a curious effect on Raymond's own sense of ownership. On one hand, watching his idea spread beyond him was gratifying, a sign that it was robust enough to stand on its own. On the other, he sometimes felt, in quieter moments, as if the story of how it had begun might slip entirely into the anonymous background of institutional learning. Yet each time he started down that path of thought, he would remind himself why he had pursued the method in the first place. It had never been about credit. It had been about watching long strings of tail numbers return instead of being erased from the board. As long as more crews came back intact, the precise wording of official histories was a secondary concern. In the broader arc of the conflict, the period during which defensive guns on bombers played a central role would not last forever. New technologies and changing strategies would eventually alter the nature of aerial combat. But in those crucial seasons when formations of heavy aircraft still depended on the eyes and hands of men in small turrets, the simple idea of treating the sky ahead not as empty space but as a fixed gate had quietly shifted the balance. And at the center of that shift stood a farm kid's insight carried through a stopwatch, a notebook, and a willingness to question the manual when the evidence of his own experience pointed in a different direction. While Raymond adjusted to the rhythm of stateside life, the full impact of the ideas he had helped introduce was unfolding an ocean away. Over the winter and into the next year, bomber groups continued to fly long missions across contested airspace. Enemy fighter units still assembled ahead of formations whenever conditions allowed, but the nature of those encounters was slowly changing. Reports compiled from various commands began to show a consistent pattern. In formations where crews had been trained in the fixed-point method for front-on approaches, few attackers completed their intended runs. In many cases, they broke away earlier, leaving gaps in their own patterns that had not been present before. The number of returning crews who could point to clear signs of having pushed attackers off their line, streams of traces intersecting, flashes near engine cowlings, visible hesitation, grew with each month. Analysts in operations rooms tracked statistics that, while abstract on paper, represented very concrete outcomes in the air. Charts of bomber losses showed discernible downturns after the new techniques were broadly adopted. The exact contribution of any single change was difficult to isolate. Improvements in planning, escort tactics, and mechanical reliability all played roles. But within the subset of missions where frontal attacks had once been especially devastating, the trend was especially pronounced. On the other side, enemy records revealed their own version of events. Interrogations of captured pilots and later accessible documents indicated that certain fighter units modified their approach profiles over time. Direct, straight-line runs toward the nose of heavy bombers, once considered a highly effective way to disrupt formations, began to be viewed as increasingly hazardous. Some units shifted to different angles of attack, others emphasized standoff methods that relied on distance rather than close-in passes. For the crews inside the bombers, the difference was not measured only in tallies but also in how it felt to face those moments. Gunners who had flown both before and after the training described a subtle change in their mindset. Where earlier frontal encounters had felt like trying to swat at a speeding train, now there was at least a sense of having a plan that matched the physics of the situation. One veteran, years later, would recall a particular mission in which the warning of fighters ahead triggered the same spike of tension as always. But this time, as he swung his turret into position, he found himself recalling, almost automatically, the instructor's calm voice. Find the point. Hold on it. Let them come through. I still felt the rush of it, he said. The noise, the vibration, everything shaking. But instead of scrambling after them, I was waiting, just for that tiny slice of time when everything lines up. When I saw the first one flinch and roll away with pieces coming off, I knew we weren't just passengers anymore. We had something that belonged to us in that exchange. Back in the United States, Raymond continued to refine his teaching, rarely pausing to consider the broader arc. Each class of trainees brought new faces, new stories, new future missions he would never hear about. He focused on making sure that, before they moved on, they understood not just what to do but why it worked. Occasionally, letters arrived from overseas, short notes from gunners he had once trained in England, or from those who had passed through his stateside courses. They rarely described incidents in detail. Security guidelines discouraged that. Instead, they tended to say things like, "Your lesson came back to me when it mattered," or "We used that forward point drill and came out of it together." Those lines meant more to him than any official comment. In quiet moments, He would reread them and picture the small window of sky ahead of a bomber where invisible geometry and human decisions intersected. That narrow zone, once mostly empty of effective fire, was now a place where crews felt they had a fighting chance. As the conflict moved toward its conclusion, other developments overshadowed the day-to-day work of gunnery instructors. Ground campaigns advanced, air strategies shifted, and new types of aircraft entered service. But for the heavy bomber crews still flying deep into contested territory, the guns and their turrets remained as relevant as ever. By the time formal hostilities in the theater came to an end, thousands of airmen had passed through courses where fixed-point engagement against frontal attacks was standard. Many of them never knew that the origin of this lesson lay in a boy watching animals cross a snow-dusted farmyard. For them, it was simply part of the craft, taught alongside many other disciplines that collectively improved their odds of returning to solid ground. When Raymond finally received notice that his active service would conclude, it arrived with little ceremony. He had the option to stay on, to accept a commission and continue building a career in the evolving air arm. It was a path that held promise, especially for someone who had demonstrated an ability to innovate. Yet he felt a pull in another direction. The same fields that had once demanded his vigilance in protecting a flock now called to him with a different kind of urgency. Years of structured schedules, of barracks life and classroom chalkboards, had left him with a desire for the straightforward rhythms of seasons, soil, and simple tasks with visible results. He chose to go home. Returning to the farm was both familiar and strangely new. The landscape had changed little. The broad sky, the rows of crops, the well-worn paths between house, barn, and chicken yard. Yet Raymond no longer saw it with a 12-year-old's eyes. He had traveled further than he had ever imagined as a boy, seen machinery and logistics on a grand scale, and watched how small decisions could ripple outward in ways few people ever traced back to their origin. On the first evening after his return, he walked out to the old fence line where he had once stood with a Winchester in hand. The wood had aged, some posts replaced, others leaning a bit more than before. The worn trails through the grass were fainter now. The local wildlife had adjusted to a quieter farm during the years he was away. He rested his palm on the top of one post and let the memories come. The sound of small paws on hard ground, the prickling awareness of motion in the dark, the moment of waiting for a swift shape to cross an invisible boundary before acting. Those experiences felt oddly connected now to nights on the gunnery range, to chalk streaks on metal wings, to young men nodding as they traced vectors in the air with calloused fingers. Life on the farm resumed its steady pace. There were tools to repair, fence lines to fix, fields to tend. Raymond built a family, attending to school concerts and local fairs instead of briefings and range schedules. When neighbors asked about his time in service, he answered simply. He had been a gunnery instructor, teaching crews how to use their equipment effectively. He did not dwell on specific missions or on the technical shift he had helped set in motion. There was no secrecy in his silence, just a sense that the larger story belonged to the many, not to one person. In his mind, the most important outcome was that more crews had returned than might otherwise have done so. The individual details, the stopwatch, the first tests, the meeting with the general, felt more like steps along the way than things to highlight in conversation. Years passed. The nature of air power continued to evolve. New generations of aircraft entered service, many designed from the outset with different assumptions about defensive armament. In some of these, traditional manned gun positions gradually gave way to other technologies, guided systems, long-range sensors, and eventually platforms that relied more on avoidance and precision than on exchanging fire at close range. As these changes took hold, training programs shifted focus. Manuals were updated. Curricula were rewritten. The sections that detailed fixed-point frontal engagement remained for a time, then were gradually folded into broader historical context. Instructors who had once stressed the importance of those techniques retired or moved on, and newer staff dealt with different challenges. In archives and storage rooms, reels of training film and stacks of paper documents recorded the techniques of an earlier era. Among them were the diagrams, notes, and recorded lectures that had once been central to the lives of men like Raymond and his students. Their relevance to current practice diminished, but their significance as a record of how people had adapted to urgent problems remained. Meanwhile, on the Kansas farm, decades blended into a pattern of planting, harvesting, and quiet family milestones. Raymond grew older, his hair silvering, his hands bearing the marks of both tools and time. The rifle he had used in his youth was cleaned and oiled occasionally, more for memory's sake than out of necessity. For his children, their father was someone who had been in the service in broad terms, but whose story centered more on the camaraderie of fellow instructors and the oddities of base life than on technical innovations. They knew he had taught airmen. They did not grasp that a principle he had brought from the fields had influenced how a major air arm addressed a specific, lethal challenge. The thread that connected the Kansas fence posts to bomber noses over Europe might have frayed completely if not for the curiosity of others. Among them was a historian who, years later, would find himself in a government archive surrounded by boxes of wartime training records. This researcher, tracing the development of defensive tactics for a book, noticed repeated references in 1943 and 1944 documents to something called fixed-point frontal fire control. The method was described as a significant adjustment to earlier teaching, with notes indicating that it had played an important role in reducing the vulnerability of bomber formations to direct approaches. What caught his eye most, however, was several early memoranda that mentioned a staff sergeant by name as instrumental in formulating and testing the method. That name, Sullivan, appeared less and less in later documents, eventually disappearing into broader references to revised gunnery doctrine. Intrigued, the historian began to chase the trail back from the institutional language to the person behind it. Veterans organizations, local records, and service lists gradually narrowed the search. Eventually, the inquiry pointed toward a small town in Kansas and a farm not far from where a much younger Raymond had once paced along a fence, listening for sounds in the dark. By the time the researcher's letter reached him, Raymond was no longer a young man. He read the carefully typed questions about his wartime work with a mixture of surprise and gentle amusement. To him, those events felt both very distant and very present, like photographs that had faded at the edges but still held clear images at the center. When the two finally met, sitting at a simple kitchen table with coffee and old paperwork spread between them, the historian asked how the fixed-point idea had come about. Raymond told the story the only way he knew how, beginning not with charts, but with winter, hungry animals, and a father who had shown him how to think about movement in a different way. He spoke, too, about the first time he had watched chalk marks bloom on an obliging fighter's wings, about the tension of approaching a general's office with a notebook full of numbers, about the quiet satisfaction of seeing anxious trainees leave his classroom a little more confident in their role. The researcher listened, took notes, and did his own calculations. By comparing mission reports and loss rates from periods before and after the adoption of the method, he produced estimates of how many crews had likely benefited from a change. The number, while approximate, was stark. Hundreds of airmen whose aircraft had come back when previous patterns suggested they might not have. When he shared these figures with Raymond, the older man sat quietly for a while. "I never counted like that," he said at last. "I thought in terms of faces in the classroom, names on rosters, the feeling when you saw them come back down the ladder from the plane. That was enough for me." "It's worth putting into the record," the historian replied. "People should understand that sometimes small shifts in how we think make a big difference in outcomes, and they often come from places no one expects." Raymond nodded slowly. "If it helps people remember the crews," he said, "then I'm glad you're writing it down. The rest, well, the rest is just something a boy learned because his family had chickens to protect." In subsequent years, the historian's work brought Raymond's story to a modest audience of readers interested in the details of aircrew training and adaptation. A chapter in a specialized book talked about the shift from pure tracking methods to fixed-point thinking for frontal engagements. It credited instructors in the European theater and singled out a Kansas sergeant as a key figure in early implementation. Within the larger sweep of conflict histories, this mention was small, almost a footnote. The grand narratives focused on major campaigns, strategic decisions, and the overall arc of events. Yet for those who noticed the passage, it offered a glimpse into the way practical innovation often happens, not through grand directives, but through one person looking at a persistent problem and asking, "What if we tried something different?" Raymond himself did not seek out these publications. Friends occasionally sent him clippings or photocopied pages, pointing out where his name appeared. He accepted them with a gentle smile, glanced through them, and then returned to his routines. In his mind, the value of the historian's work lay less in the formal recognition and more in the assurance that the efforts of gunners, instructors, and commanders would not vanish completely into dusty folders. Time, as it tends to do, continued its steady work. Children grew up and started families of their own. The farms saw good years and lean ones. Raymond's step slowed a bit, but he remained active as long as he could, accustomed to days structured around chores and small tasks rather than around complex timetables and operations briefings. Eventually, his journey came to a quiet close. News of his passing spread mostly within the local community. neighbors, relatives, people who had known him as a steady presence in town meetings and at church gatherings. The notice in the local paper described him as a farmer, a family man, and a veteran who had served as a gunnery instructor during the Great Conflict. It did not detail how far that teaching had reached. On the day of the memorial service, family members gathered in a modest hall. Stories were shared about Raymond's patience, his dry humor, his tendency to solve practical problems with simple, well-thought-out solutions. Some remembered how he had fixed a piece of equipment with an improvised tool, or how he had stepped in quietly to help neighbors through difficult times. Partway through the service, 3 men arrived whom the immediate family did not recognize. They were not from the area. Their bearing and the insignia on their jackets suggested they had once worn uniforms of their own. They sat respectfully toward the back until the formal remarks concluded, then approached Raymond's children with a mixture of reserve and determination. "Excuse us," one of them said, offering his hand. "We hope this isn't an intrusion. We came a long way to be here today." Another continued, "Years ago, we flew in heavy bombers. Different groups, different missions. But we all had one thing in common. We were trained in a particular way of handling head-on attacks, a way that came from your father's work." They explained, in simple terms, how the fixed-point method had been presented to them in training, how instructors had emphasized its importance, sometimes mentioning a sergeant who had first proven its value. They spoke of missions where that brief moment of holding fire on an invisible point ahead had made the difference between attackers sweeping through unchallenged and attackers veering off, leaving the formation intact. "We can't say with certainty what would have happened without that method," one of the visitors said. "But we are pretty sure some of us wouldn't be here to tell you this story. We wanted you to know that his efforts traveled far beyond that farm and touched lives he never met." For Raymond's children, the picture of their father expanded in that moment. The man they had known, who had mended fences, reminded them to close the coop door properly, and taught them to keep their word, suddenly stood in a longer line of influence, one that stretched back to European skies and forward to the present through the lives of these visitors. The conversation that followed was not long or sentimental. It was practical, in keeping with the tone Raymond himself might have preferred. The former airman shared a few specific memories of training sessions and missions, then listened as the family recounted small stories from home life. There was an unspoken understanding between them. They were not there to elevate anyone to legend, but to connect pieces of a larger story so that it would not be incomplete. After they left, one of Raymond's children picked up an old notebook that had been kept in a box of his belongings. Its pages, filled with faded pencil lines, contained many of the same diagrams the historian had seen years earlier in official copies. Bomber silhouettes, approach angles, carefully marked points along imagined paths. Beyond their technical meaning, those pages now seemed like a bridge between two worlds, a reminder that what begins as a personal attempt to protect one's own responsibilities can, in some circumstances, grow into something much larger. Today, the era of heavily armed propeller-driven bombers trading fire with opponents at relatively close range has passed into history. Modern aircraft fly faster and higher. Their defenses rely on a mixture of electronic measures, long-range systems, and careful planning designed to prevent certain kinds of encounters from happening at all. The specific tactics that once dominated training films are now studied more as case studies than as current practice. Yet the principles underlying those stories remain relevant. At their core, they speak to the way people adapt under pressure, how they use whatever experience they have to solve problems when existing guidance falls short. Raymond's fixed-point method may seem, at first glance, like a technical footnote in the larger tale of the conflict. But look closer, and it becomes an example of something more universal. Faced with a situation where the official approach was not delivering desired results, he did not simply accept the losses as inevitable. Instead, he reached back to something learned in a different context, translated it into new terms, and tested it carefully. He listened to the realities his students described, measured where he could, and refused to be satisfied with an answer that existed only in diagrams if it did not hold up in practice. His idea did not emerge from advanced laboratories or committees filled with specialists. It came from a young person who had once watched tracks in the snow and realized that movement often followed patterns. It was validated not through theory alone, but through repeated confirmation on a range and in the reports of crews who put it to use when it mattered most. Stories like this remind us that innovation in challenging times often happens in the spaces between formal structures. It is shaped by individuals who notice that what is supposed to work sometimes doesn't, and who have the courage to propose alternatives even when they contradict established habits. They also highlight the importance of leaders who are willing to listen to those voices, as General Anderson did when he gave a sergeant 15 minutes and an open mind. There is, too, a quieter lesson in how the story almost faded. For years, the method was known primarily as a standard part of doctrine, divorced from the particular journey that had brought it into being. Only through the efforts of a curious researcher and the persistence of memory in a few surviving documents did the path back to a Kansas farm become visible again. That is often how it goes. Many of the most important adjustments in any large endeavor, whether in aviation, medicine, engineering, or everyday community life, are made by people whose names never become widely known. They solve immediate problems, share their solutions with those around them, and then step back into their routines. The larger system moves on, carried forward partly by their contributions, even if no one stops to attach a plaque to the idea. Remembering these stories does not mean ignoring the broader sweep of events. Rather, it adds texture to our understanding. It reminds us that behind every chart showing improved outcomes, there are human beings who noticed patterns, took risks, and cared enough to try something new. It emphasizes that courage is not only found in dramatic moments under bright lights, but also in quiet acts of reasoning and teaching carried out in classrooms, on ranges, and along fence lines at dusk. When we look back at the image suggested by the title of this story, a young person from a rural background, devising what some might call an insane trick shot that would change how dozens of crews faced a particular hazard, we see more than just a clever aim. We see someone who bridged two worlds, the practical wisdom of small-scale life and the large, complex machinery of a global conflict. The next time you encounter a chart, a process, or a rule that seems impersonal, it may be worth asking whose experience lies beneath it. Somewhere, at some point, a real person probably looked at a situation that felt impossible and asked, "Is there another way?" Sometimes, that other way might come from a source as unexpected as a child watching the line between a coop and a stand of trees. Raymond's story, in the end, is not just about aircraft, firing solutions, or revised manuals. It is about the enduring possibility that simple, grounded insights can make a real difference when applied with care. It is about the way one person's determination to protect those entrusted to him, whether they are members of a crew or a flock in a yard, can ripple outward across distance and time. Most of all, it is a reminder that many of the people who quietly shape outcomes never think of themselves as heroes. They see themselves as doing their job, solving the problem in front of them, living up to a responsibility. Long after they are gone, their influence may remain in the routines of others, in the subtle changes that turn the balance during critical moments. A heavy bomber pointing its nose toward distant clouds. A turret gunner steadying his hands on cold grips. An instructor watching the clock, counting the seconds it takes for danger to cross the last stretch of sky. A boy on a farm, waiting for a shadow to pass a fence post. These images, though separated by context, share a common thread: attention, patience, and the willingness to act at exactly the right moment. That is the legacy carried in the story of how a farm kid's unusual way of aiming helped turn open sky into a little less of a one-sided avenue and a little more of a place where those he trained could stand their ground.